for the last class periods, we've been involved in looking at a number of different areas regarding leadership. And as we continue to make our way through this material, a couple of areas that we're going to look at today, and then on Wednesday, when we come back into the class, we're going to specifically begin looking at some of the individuals from Scripture. We want to look and highlight some different people that we read about in the Old Testament and in the New Testament to help us see some various qualities that they possessed, that they demonstrated, in areas that we see their leadership begin to evolve and why it evolved in the way that it did. But today, as we begin this new section, I want us to focus on why men reject the will of God. And the reason for this particular section in leadership is because if we know why men reject the will of God, then it helps us to understand what we need to do to help lead them out of that situation into a relationship with God. And the thing that we need to remember is that when you're working within a congregation or a setting of members of the church, if it's in the world, it's going to be in the church. And there are going to be people who have come out of the world. Think about the various circumstances with which Paul wrote, for example, to the church at Corinth. He was writing about a situation that existed in the church there, and the reason was because what happened is you have people who have come out of a paganistic idolatry background into the church, and they're carrying those philosophies and those concepts into their relationship with God in the setting of the church. And so he's addressing those matters in that letter. And so when you work with members of the church, you have to realize they come from different backgrounds. And knowing why some men reject the will of God will help prepare all of us in being able to deal with those situations, which is why this material is where it is. So let's talk about some of the areas that would fit into this category. And we're not going to look at many of them, but I think it deserves an opportunity for us to at least explore for just a moment what you think as far as how would you answer this question. Why do men today reject the will of God? How would you answer that?
One is their worldview.
Self?
Their worldview.
Worldview?
It reminds me of that men love darkness, do not want to come into the light.
All right. They love the darkness.
Fear of being exposed.
And I tell you, there's a great fear
You got to
that
deal with your
exists
life.
being exposed. What other ideas?
Confusion.
Confusion.
I think that falls in with the God of this world blinding the eyes of those who perish.
Ah, okay. Sad, but so true. I mean, it was happening in the first century. It sure happens today.
Kind of goes over some of the other comments, but just priorities.
All right. Priorities get skewed in a hurry, don't they? Doesn't take long, and not intentionally rejecting the will of God, but as a result of some of these areas, what happens is it tends to be the natural evolution of that, to where we begin to no longer accept and follow the will of God, and not thinking that we have rejected it by those practices.
People are comfortable, they don't want to have to change their lives.
Oh,
Selfishness.
yes.
Self-sufficiency, unless you see your need, great need for...
And I tell you, I really categorize those together. We're going to talk, and that's one we have on the list here, but that whole concept, I started to basically put the term self, because the idea of selfishness and self-sufficient, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment, but self is such a high area that regards why men reject the will of God. It's the reason Eve did in the garden. Even though she knew the consequences, God had told her. She even told the serpent exactly what God said, but she rejected God's will because that drive of self. Rob?
Say, sometimes they take on a victim's attitude of, I've had conversations with people where, just to be facetious, they'll say, well, what if I didn't want to be created in the first place? Or, like they feel like God placed them in these insurmountable circumstances that that's not fair. I mean,
I'm smiling because I was talking with Michael yesterday, and he was telling about his trip back from Houston on the airplane, and he was sitting next to a gentleman that he was trying to study with. Maybe this was when he's come back from Africa, but anyway, this guy was a Church of Christ scientist. And so they had a pretty good dialogue going, and this guy finally looked at Mike and he says, "You know, we're really not on this plane." And Michael went, "It sure feels like I'm on this plane. If I'm not, where am I?" But you see, people come with such different views and backgrounds to those kind of things, and they take a victim's approach or whatever it might be.
And well, it may fall under self in a way, but say like, thou shalt not lie. Well, I don't lie, but I don't want someone telling me not to lie. You know, submissive, being
Very good. Not wanting to be submissive. And really, all of the ideas that we're expressing, we're going to see in the list.
I would think pleasure of sin.
Let's just start there, shall we? Since you brought it up, worldly pleasure, the pleasure of sin. It's interesting when we think about, obviously, the reference that you're making there in Hebrews chapter 11 with Moses. He did not want, he was not going to participate in the passing pleasure of sin, but rather he chose to endure affliction with the people of God. And it's sad, but it's so true, that worldly pleasure causes people to reject the will of God. And the area that I'm thinking about most is in the parable of the sower. And whether you're reading Matthew's account or you read Luke's account, it's interesting that in looking at both of those, there is one section when you think about the seed that fell among the thorns. Worldly pleasure, the cares of the world, the deceitfulness of riches. It depends on the account. There are different terms that are used. But the idea is it chokes out the word. Even though they accepted it initially with joy, it was choked out because of those worldly pleasures. And it's true, isn't it? It's just as true today as it was then. How worldly pleasures work to choke out the will of God in people's lives. Several years ago, back even before I was a Christian, I was involved in working in a construction rental company. And it was heavy construction equipment that we were involved in renting out. I had this young man that I knew him, and I knew he attended the church out in Greenbrier, and hired him. And so we had a lot of discussions, and when we had some downtime and talking about a number of different areas. And the statement he made to me that I thought was so fascinating is he said, "It's just so easy to do what is wrong, and so hard to do what is right." I said, "Really, it's not." I said, "The only reason it's easy to do what is wrong is because that's what you want to do." And that's why worldly pleasure appeals to so many people. It's what they want. They want pleasure. They seek for it. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life from 1 John 2, verse 15. And so they're seeking that's what they want, because they see that the pleasure that results from it is going to satisfy, at least in their mind, if even for a moment, what they desire. A second reason that we've already talked a great deal about, and a number of you made reference to, is the idea of selfishness. And again, I started to put just the term self up there. But when we are selfish, we reject the will of God. And you can go through, there are a number of different terms. I've mentioned this before in class, the idea of just take a dictionary sometime and look at the number of words that are associated with the idea of self. Self-appointed, self-sufficient, self-righteous, self-reliant, and the list goes on and on and on. And I believe with all my heart, as I've said before, it's the greatest false god that exists. It was the problem with Eve in the beginning, and it's the problem with man today. The reason people reject the will of God is because they desire more to please themselves than they do anything else. And if we were going to take these first two categories, you got worldly pleasure, and you got self. Can you think of a passage of Scripture that would be an antidote, if you will, to both of these? Kind of put together, it's in the same context, what I'm thinking about, But there is a passage of Scripture that really helps us understand how to combat these two specific areas. We've talked about the first two verses in a lot of different contexts in this class and other classes.
1 John 2.
Well, I wasn't thinking 1 John 2. And really, this is one of those areas that is really undefined for you guys because I'm not really giving the information you need. Romans chapter 12. We've talked a great deal about Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed. There has to be a change that takes place. I don't know that I'll ever read verse 2 again, Brad, without thinking about your 90 seconds of power last week. I mean, there's such a drastic change that took place when Bannon became the Hulk. I mean, there was no way you were going to confuse the one with the other. Well, and that's the way it should be for us. I mean, there should never be an opportunity where people are going to confuse who we used to be before we became a Christian to who we are now as a Christian. Do not be conformed. Don't allow the world to mold and shape us. But instead, we need to be transformed. There needs to be a change, a metamorphosis that takes place so that we become this new person. But in verse 3, same context, he tells us that we're not to think more highly of ourselves. Not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. And so here in just 3 verses, really, verses 2 and 3, but in this context of these first 3 verses of Romans chapter 12, he's going to provide a wealth of information to help us combat just these first 2 areas. Worldly pleasure and selfishness. But a third reason why men reject the will of God is indifference. And guys, this is tough. This is a tough one. And the reason it's tough is because we're living in a world that's very indifferent. Apathy and indifference are killers when it comes to trying to reach people with the message of Jesus. And you know, the sad part is, and I don't remember who I read this from many, many years ago, but the idea is that it's not that people just don't care about religion. They don't care about a lot of things. I mean, when you look in the world around us, isn't it amazing how that the news today, that in 2 or 3 days from now will not be news? People will have forgotten because it just doesn't matter anymore. It's not as important. I mean, how many times, every time the anniversary of 9/11 comes around, how many times do we hear phrases like, don't forget? But see, the problem is we do forget. I find it interesting that when we talk to people religiously, especially in a denominational context, about the idea of not observing the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis, but observing it yearly or quarterly, and their terminology as to why that they don't want to observe it weekly is so that it doesn't become commonplace. And in my mind, I'm thinking the Lord instituted it weekly so that we wouldn't forget and become indifferent towards the sacrifice of Jesus. And I don't know if it's because people in the world are just trying to go along and to go with the flow and to kind of accept what's easiest, most popular, take the easiest path. I mean, you think about Matthew chapter 7. In verses 13 and 14, he talks about 2 paths, 2 gates, 2 paths. One is broad, one is narrow. And really, do you know why it's so easy to walk the broad path? Because you can be indifferent. I mean, it doesn't matter. You can take anything you want. I mean, you can take bad language, you can take adultery, you can take homosexuality. I mean, it accepts anything and everything, and so you can be indifferent toward all of it. Have you ever thought about why Hollywood is blasting us as a culture in our country with all of the programs that are speaking about homosexuality? Do you know why? Because we become indifferent. The more we see it, the more indifferent we become towards it. And therefore we become more accepting. I read this, and again, I don't know who the person is that I read this from. This is just one of those quotes that I have in my notes that says, someone once said. But the statement is, following the path of least resistance makes both rivers and men crooked. Now think about that for just a moment. Following the path of least resistance makes both rivers and men crooked. And people reject the will of God because they are indifferent. They really want to follow that easy path, the path of least resistance. And as a result, they reject the will of God. Another reason, and perhaps falls in line with this, and to me they kind of come in pairs, but the idea of peer pressure. Peer pressure. People reject the will of God because of peer pressure. And what's sad is we tend to think that peer pressure is basically a youth thing. We tend to think that it's really something we need to warn our children about, our young people about, is this idea of peer pressure. But peer pressure affects all of us at different levels. And it really affects people when they're involved in working in the world. You see, it's easy to be a Christian when you're around Christians all the time. This is a very sheltered environment. You guys are all day, every day focused on areas that are biblical and spiritual and uplifting. And we go to chapel and we sing together and we encourage one another every day. And you're getting classes that are strengthening you spiritually and in your faith and in your knowledge and understanding of God's Word. And so this is a positive peer pressure environment. But what about the individual who has to go into the world environment every day? And they face the abusive language and the indifference and the negativity and the hatred and the anger and the immorality. I mean, they're blasted with it every day with everybody that they see on the job. I mean, it wears on you after a while. And you begin to start thinking, maybe it's not as bad as I'm thinking. Maybe God isn't going to be as harsh on them. I mean, look, they're good people. They're misguided and they're following the path of worldly pleasure or self and peer pressure. And we begin to think that it's okay for us to participate in some of those questionable activities. We got to be careful. Now, when I think about the idea of peer pressure, the verse that comes to mind is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Now,
1 Corinthians what?
15, verse 33.
Thank you.
About, it's probably been 8 or 9 years ago now. But I was in Conway, Arkansas, was working at the Greenbrier about 8 miles away, and so I happened to be downtown. I had to go to the office supply place to pick up some different objects and items for the office. And when I walked in, they had one of these big poster signs, kind of like this map over here on the wall. But anyway, this poster, on it said, what is popular may not always be what is right. And what is right may not always be what is popular. You see, the whole concept of peer pressure is that we want to fit in. We want to belong. You remember the old television show Cheers? Yes. You remember the theme song? I want to go where everybody knows my name. I mean, that's what people want. They want that acceptance, that I fit in here. And the sad part is people begin thinking, I've got to go along to get along, and I've got to be involved if I'm going to fit in. And so they give in to those temptations in order to fit in with everyone else. And I don't know but what it's a greater problem with adults than it is with teens, even though it's a great problem with our teens. And maybe they learn it from their teenage years and they just carry it into their adult life. But we need to realize that what is popular may not always be what is right, and what is right may not always be what is popular. Now, I used to get tickled with my kids. I don't know for you who have children or who have children who are raised. If your kids ever said anything to you like, but everybody's doing it. Well, you guys remember from Genesis, don't you? The only time everybody was doing it was in the garden. It was sin. So it's first of all not true that everyone is doing it. But secondly, the only time in history that everyone did do it was in the garden, and it was sin. So make your choice. Be careful about peer pressure and how peer pressure works in our lives today, and especially when we're talking about dealing with people who have rejected the will of God. Oftentimes it's because of that peer pressure. It doesn't make it right, but it exists. And if you know it exists, then we need to learn how to deal with that. Another area, and this is a fascinating area for me when it comes to why people reject the will of God, and that is unbelief. Unbelief. You want to know the number one reason why people do not pray more? This is it. They really don't. They don't think, or they really don't believe that it does any good. I prayed and prayed and prayed. God didn't answer. I didn't get what I wanted. Didn't get what I was asking for. And without really even giving thought to what they were praying for or why they were praying for it, unbelief. Now, I want you to take your Bibles for just a moment. Obviously, there are a lot of different passages we could look at, but there's one particular passage in Romans chapter 4 that I want us to look at. And probably need to back up a few verses to get the context of it. Verse 20 is where we're headed. But someone back up there kind of where the paragraph begins, probably about verse 18, 19, and read down through verse 20. We're talking about Abraham in the context. And obviously what's powerful about this particular section of Scripture is Paul is using it to show that he was righteous. It was accounted to him as righteousness because of his faith. But notice this particular text. Here's a guy, and we've studied about him in the book of Genesis, concerning the aspect of his faith and the magnitude of it to offer his son, or at least to be ready to do so, as a sacrifice. Nathan, read for us, if you would, beginning about verse 18, 19, wherever that paragraph begins, read down through verse 20.
Okay. Beginning in verse 16.
16, okay.
That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom we believe, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence things that do not exist. In hope he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told. So shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in the faith as he gave glory to God.
That's such a rich text, great text to preach, because it really involves the fact that we need to have the same kind of faith. And he talked about in hope against hope, but specifically, the ESV uses the term, he did not weaken in faith. New American Standard uses what term? He was unwavering. I like the term unwavering. Both are going to display this or portray the same idea. But he did not weaken. He did not waver in his faith. Now, think about what was going on when this statement was made about him. He was 100 years old. His wife Sarah was 90. And thinking about the deadness of her womb, God promised that he would have a son, that Sarah would bring forth a son, and you will call his name Isaac. And the text here in Romans tells us he did not waver. He did not weaken in his faith. But he believed in God. Have you ever thought about why it is that when you're talking to various people about projects to be involved in the church, you're going to hear people say things like, that's not going to work here. We've tried that. People just don't want to hear it anymore. I'll never forget in Greenbrier, we had a men's business meeting one occasion, and we were talking about trying to do a campaign. I was going to try to get a group of guys to come down from here at Bear Valley to do a campaign. Wanted to have a campaign at Greenbrier, and the overriding opinion of the men in the congregation, led by one particular individual, was, we have already talked to everybody in this town, and people are not interested. What was the problem? This. You see, they didn't really believe that the power was in the Word of God and that it could change people's lives. They already felt like that they had made that attempt in the past, and therefore it was useless to try to do anything like that in the future. People have a lack of faith. Wes?
We also, I think, need to make special note on what you're talking about, the verses 21 and 22, which Nathan didn't read, but it says, in being fully assured as to what God has promised. If we are fully assured of what God has promised, then we're going to pray in faith. Ask a child, and they'll tell you what can Daddy do? They'll say Daddy can do anything, and they do it with 100% faith. They do not know how. They don't know why, but they're doing that in 100% faith, that they will be able to ask for such a thing. And then it says it was also credited to him as righteousness. God hears the prayers of a righteous man.
Yes.
If we're not faithful, 100% fully assured of his promises, and we're not right with God, then we're going to have problems. But if we do those two things, it tells us what great things we can accomplish with our prayers.
Very good. Great text.
I was just going to say, the whole thing we're talking about here is why do people, what was the title of it? Why do men reject God's will? And when you first put that up there, my first thought was, why do people in the world reject God's will? But you just made another point that I was not looking at it as, is people in the church are rejecting the will of God.
Yes.
And we do. And like you just said, is it the will of God for us to get out there? Yeah. But these people were already so stymied by their unbelief that they weren't willing to try anything. So.
And really, it's going to happen in a lot of different areas. I mean, we could look at a number of different scenarios, but the underlying core problem as to why we're not enacting various areas to help the church grow and reach out more in the community is because we really don't believe. And I think that's why we often see, and as Wes was talking about, concerning our own prayers. Do you really think about, or do you listen to what's being prayed? I mean, a prayer offered in faith versus just a prayer that Jesus referred to as one that becomes a meaningless repetition. There's a difference in those two, and you can tell the difference in those two when you listen, or even when you think about your very own words when you're expressing. Do we pray with the kind of faith that we believe God is going to answer us? Interesting thought.
Right along with what Wes had to say about that passage, Hebrews 11:13 says all these, and Abraham is one of the main important ones of these,
Sure.
died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They lived their lives believing without ever seeing it.
Yeah.
And just exactly what you said. Well, we tried it. We didn't see any results. That's not what faith is about.
That's right. And I was thinking about, I forget who it was I was talking to now, yesterday or the day before, but the aspect of Thomas. I think sometimes we really are like Thomas. We're not going to believe unless we can see it. Now, not necessarily talking about Jesus, but you remember Thomas, he said, unless I put my fingers into the nail prints of his hands and my fist into his side, I will not believe. Well, do we have to have some kind of visual confirmation from God in order for us to have the kind of faith that Donnie is talking about here, that we would welcome it from afar even though we haven't seen it? Faith.
I think of a couple of things that came to mind is the Old Testament where these people were not able to enter the promised land because of the unbelief.
Yes.
I think of Jesus when he was in Nazareth. He said, I couldn't perform anything here because of the unbelief. And I think, God, we have to remind ourselves. I mean, I remind myself that, hey, God is for me. He wants to answer my prayers in His timing. I may think it now
Yeah.
because of instant gratification, but it's over the years learned to wait, and then look back in hindsight, wow, thank God he didn't answer that prayer because it wasn't.
Well, and you bring up an interesting thought. When we consider what Jesus said about the reason why he did not do miracles there because of unbelief. Now, I'm apart from miraculous, obviously, but the standpoint of, have you ever considered what the church could do or how it could grow, but it is not because of our unbelief? I tell you, we need to give grave consideration to the aspect of faith, how faith works, and the power of faith in our life, and not discount what God can do because of our unbelief. On Sunday, it's interesting. I've gotten to know the missions committee there at Levy in some great ways, and love them. They're such good people. And it was interesting that after they announced that they had already broken the goal of 275,000, one of the missions committee members was talking to me, and I was like, I'm just constantly amazed at the generosity of this congregation and the leadership that has brought them this far over the years to giving the way that they do. And one of the missions committee members said to me, he said, you'd think I'd learn. One of these days, I don't know what God is going to do to me because of my lack of faith. He said, I never thought we would be able to do that. I said, brother, they've done it every year. How many times do they have to show you that they're going to do this? And it's because they believe. And when the leadership has that kind of faith in people, then people will respond. And their faith ultimately is in God, who is working through them to do that. Albert?
I was talking about belief in prayer. Sometimes we overlook that you got to be righteous if you want your prayers answered. Obedience comes with these prayers being answered. If an unrighteous man is doing a lot of praying and nothing's being answered, maybe he should look at where his obedience is at. Is he following false doctrine? Is he following the truth? What is he practicing in his life to have these prayers answered?
And the sad part is, he may not ever reach that point, but from our standpoint as Christians, we need to make sure that we're not allowing our lack of faith to prevent us from being who God wants us to be and accomplishing what God wants us to accomplish.
It's real easy right here in this sanctum of
Yes.
greatness. Oh, believe y'all, dog. Woo, let's praise Jesus. But when we're going out into our congregations to lead them as leaders, it's a whole different story. What happens after we get shot down about 2, 3, 4 times? I mean, we're fired up.
Yes.
We're cranked up. And we want to save the world. And the elders say, he's fresh out of preaching school. He'll
Yes.
calm down. They've said that to people.
Yes.
They'll calm down. Just give them time. We're trying to save souls, and we're fired up, and you want me to calm down? So then what happens to our disposition? That's when this right here can
That's
really kick
exactly
in.
right. Such a great point. And we're going to talk about later on in this quarter some areas specifically in addressing just exactly what you said. How do we deal with those situations when we are shot down? And it may, the first time's not so bad. But when it's repeatedly, your ideas are just, you're just fresh out of school. How do we do that? What happens to our faith? Do we begin to be comfortable with just going along with the flow, or do we allow our faith to arise and trust in God to use us in ways that will bring about those changes? So we're going to talk more about that as we go on. So unbelief is one of those areas. Laziness is also one of the reasons why men reject the will of God. Laziness. You know the parable, obviously. You guys have studied the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 14, we have the parable of the talents. And obviously we're aware that the term talent is referring to a certain amount of money. And so the way the parable reads and goes along is you have a master who's called 3 of his servants together, and he gave each one of them a certain amount of money. To one he gave 5 talents, to one he gave 2, and to a third he gave 1 talent. And one of the phrases in this text that we often overlook is the phrase, according to their abilities. Now that's a very significant phrase in understanding what takes place in this parable. They each, all 3 of them, had certain abilities that the master knew and recognized, in which he entrusted them with this certain amount of money to be a steward of it. And so he goes away on a journey. When he returns, he calls these 3 servants together to give an account. And you know how the parable goes. The one who had 5 talents of money and the one who had 2 talents of money, both of them doubled what they had been given. And they were rewarded. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I'll make you ruler of many things. Enter into the joys of your Father. But the servant who had been given 1 talent came back and he gave the master the 1 talent. He said, Master, I knew that you were a hard man, that you reaped where you did not sow, you gathered where you scattered no seed, and I was afraid. And so I took your talent and I buried it in the ground. Here is what is yours. And the master is angry, and he says, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I was a hard man, that I reaped where I did not sow and gathered where I scattered no seed. You should have at least put the money in the bank so that I could have drawn interest upon my return. So he condemned him to outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not, but the condemnation of the servant who had 1 talent was not because he was covetous. He didn't try to steal from the master. He gave him back exactly what he had been given. He wasn't condemned because he lied. He wasn't condemned because he was a homosexual. He wasn't condemned because he was a murderer. He was condemned very simply because he chose to do nothing. Now that's a powerful lesson in my mind. That an individual who had the ability, I mean the text is clear that he had the ability, but he chose to do nothing because he was afraid. And he was condemned for his laziness. Now, I don't know why people become lazy. I don't know why, maybe in our own lives, there are times that we go through a period where we become lazy in our approach to whatever it is in our leadership. Maybe it's because we lack the vision. Maybe it's because we've been shot down, because we've been discouraged, because we're dealing with trials in our life. I don't know. The reason could be multiple. But what we do have to realize is that whether it's us or whether it's someone we're trying to lead, that people reject the will of God because they're lazy. Maybe it's out of fear. Maybe it's indifference. Maybe it's worldly pleasure, selfishness that we've already talked about, one of those areas. But the bottom line is that laziness will keep people from accepting and following the will of God. Another area that I want us to look at, and this touches on something that was brought up earlier by Lynn, and that is that lack of understanding, maybe the confusion that exists. I am convinced that people will do better when they know better. Now, not every case, obviously. Some people just willingly don't want to do better. But we're looking at a list of reasons as to why people reject the will of God. And there are times that people are going to reject it because they really don't know it. And we find that to be biblical. But we have to realize that it's not an excuse that's going to be accepted on the day of judgment. God's not going to say, well, you didn't understand that, just come on in. I mean, we have a responsibility
but we have a responsibility as leaders. I mean, think about the priest. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, he says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Now, where was that knowledge supposed to come from? The priests, the very leaders of the Jewish nation, were to be providing them with this information. And really, he's condemning the priests in the context of Hosea chapter 4, verse 6.
Isn't that also kind of a problem of laziness on the leadership as well?
Very good. Exactly. And maybe they get comfortable. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But a lack of understanding. How many times do we have to see throughout the New Testament an emphasis upon growing in knowledge before we get the idea that God intends for us to not be lacking in our understanding? He says, "Do not be foolish," in Ephesians chapter 5, "but understand what the will of the Lord is." We have a responsibility. And as leaders, that becomes even greater responsibility, just as James chapter 3, verse 1 teaches us. "Do not let many of you be teachers, knowing that you shall incur a stricter judgment." That places a great deal of responsibility. I'll never forget when I was in school here many years ago, one of the instructors made reference to the fact that a student came here, don't know who it was, couldn't tell you his name if I'd heard it. But he came to school here, and he dropped out after the first quarter, and the reason was because, in his words, "I'm learning too much, and I don't want to be responsible." Guys, we are responsible. But with that responsibility, we need to understand the opportunity. You see, here's what I believe responsibility is. If you have the ability and opportunity, it equals responsibility. You guys have the ability, and God will give you the opportunities. And so, let's fulfill that responsibility and not allow a lack of understanding. I don't know how many times I've heard people over the years say something like this. Someone will be involved in some kind of a sin, or maybe they're a young Christian and they got involved in something after, they've been in the church for a year or two, and another member in the congregation recognized what was going on. And I've heard them say to me, in condemning this individual, they know better. And I'm like, do they really? Do they really know better? You see, sometimes we need to realize that a lack of understanding and a proper application of God's Word will cause people to reject God's will for their lives. And so it becomes one of those areas that obviously needs to stand out. Another reason why people reject the will of God is because of inconvenience. This one's an interesting one to me, because Christianity is not a half-time, part-time, when I've got time religion. You're either all in or you're out. There is no one foot in the world and one foot in the church. It doesn't work that way. But we often find that what takes place in our world today is this idea that if it's not convenient, then people aren't going to do it. We have created a culture that relies upon convenience. I mean, go figure. How many people get mad because it took them 3 minutes in the line at McDonald's instead of a minute and a half? I mean, get my food out here. And I tell you, it cracks me up. Wait till you guys, some of you have already done this, wait till you go overseas and you go to a restaurant and you order your food. I think sometimes they had to go pluck the chicken before they butchered it to serve. I mean, you will be there 45 minutes before, and if not longer, before you get your food. I mean, we have, and it just cracks me up, especially when people go for the first time. They're like, "Man, we've been here. Where's our food?" And I'm like, "They're working on it." I don't know. Maybe they had to clean the kitchen before they started on yours. But the thing is,
No, they weren't cleaning.
they weren't cleaning the kitchen. But the thing is, we want things convenient. I mean, I want it, and I want it now. And if it's not convenient for me, then I'm not involved. Do you remember what Felix told Paul? Acts 24, verse 25. Go away for a season. When I find a convenient time, I will send for you. As far as we know from Scripture, he never found that convenient time. Sad, isn't it? If it's not convenient, I'm not going to be involved. And yet, that's one of the reasons people reject the will of God.
In my entire life, I can never remember a single work in the church, special activity, gospel meeting, VBS, anything that was not scheduled around that very thing.
Of course. Well, and this is not a bad thing, but it's just a terminology thing. It's one of those pet peeves for me. That how many times have you heard someone right before we take up the offering, the elders have chosen this as a convenient time for us to take up an offering. Guys, there's no better time than when I have just thought about what God gave me. When Jesus gave his life for me, it should be the most humiliating experience for me to look at what I'm putting in the plate compared to what God gave to me. It's not about convenience. But we do so many areas, gospel meetings, vacation Bible schools, and we build them around what is convenient. Well, we don't have any football games going on this time of year. We don't have any basketball games going on. We don't have this going on. And so we've got to schedule what's convenient. And that's what's happened to our faith on the part of many and why they reject the will of God. It's just not convenient for me. Another reason why people reject the will of God is a lack of leadership. And really this is the summation of what we've looked at, kind of wrapping up this particular section. And that is a lack of leadership. You want to know why people reject the will of God? It's because they need leaders. They don't have leadership. I truly believe that when leaders step up and lead the way that God demands of us to lead, and we can list out all the reasons why we don't. In fact, we're going to be talking about in just a moment some of the challenges, too, why people don't lead. But when you think about the idea of the lack of leadership, when that leadership is not there, what would cause people to follow the will of God? See, they need leaders. Leaders are vital to helping point people. That's why this section is here, to understand why people reject the will of God. And if we understand that, then to know how we need to lead them so that we can help them overcome those areas.
I was just going to say that the whole idea of leaders, that they're needed, I mean, you follow a leader, and so you look at their example, and so there's beyond the fact that they're going to give you direction, but their life is an example, and so there needs to be that as well. So I was just...
Yeah, that's it, right. That's exactly right. Well, I want us to move from this section as we think about a lack of leadership, and what we're going to specifically begin looking at is going to involve addressing what challenges leaders to lead. What kind of challenges do leaders face? And really this is going to involve more a self-examination, but a combination of examining a number of external as well as internal areas that present challenges to our leading. And the first and foremost is they lack ability. When we think about what challenges leaders to lead, they lack ability. Now, I want you to think about something for just a moment. Two areas specifically here in regards to this. Potential is not the same thing as ability. Now, you're going to have a lot of people say something like, Brother Joe has such potential. He may have great potential, but that doesn't mean he has the ability to be a leader. And so that lack of ability is going to keep him from leading. So don't confuse potential with ability. Secondly, do not confuse experience with ability. Simply because somebody has tons and tons and tons of experience does not make them a leader. Certainly not a good leader or even a spiritual leader. And so when we think about this idea of what it is that really challenges leaders to lead, it begins here. Now, later in the quarter, we're going to be looking at some specific areas, one of which is potential. And we're going to talk about how we can raise leadership ability. And what's amazing is you can have people that put out tons and tons and tons and tons of effort. I mean, they are workhorses. But they don't have the leadership ability, and so their level of influence doesn't rise above that. But if you can increase their ability, then when they put that same effort forth, then you're going to see the level of their influence increase in dramatic ways. So when you see someone that has potential, what we have to do is we have to work to develop the ability of that individual so that they will then begin to utilize their leadership influence in ways to achieve the greatest good. So one of the areas that challenges leadership in leading is a lack of ability. And we're just going to go through a number of different areas very quickly. But later on in the quarter, we're going to deal with some interaction where we're going to specifically talk about how to address some of these areas and how we achieve them. A second area that challenges leaders or leadership in leading is they lack courage. They lack courage. There are so many examples in Scripture, but one that stands out to me when I think of courage, it just rises to the forefront every time, and that's David. And I think about David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's just an incredible story. The account of what takes place is here you have this guy that's 9 feet tall, and he is a massive man. I mean, first of all, think about why the Israelites were afraid to go into the land of Canaan to begin with. I mean, there were giants in the land. They saw themselves as grasshoppers, and they knew that they were seen as grasshoppers in the sight of others. But here you have David and Goliath, and David comes down, and he's like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who taunts the armies of the living God of Israel? He's appalled at the cowardice on the part of the nation of Israel, the army. Now, this is going to tie in with the very next point we're going to talk about. But think about what David faced. First of all, his brothers are going to discourage him. Did you just come down here to make fun of us? Is that the only reason you came down here? I mean, here's a shepherd boy, maybe 17 to 20 years of age. I mean, we don't know the exact age, but he's young. I mean, his father sent him down to see what was going on, to take some food to his brothers, and his brothers say, did you just come down here to make fun of us? And then someone takes him to Saul. And then the king discourages him. And notice how King Saul, the leadership of Israel, what he says to David is, you are but a youth. And Goliath has been a warrior from his youth. So Saul is discouraging him. But David doesn't give up. Look, I've protected my sheep against a lion and a bear, and God delivered both of them into my hands. And this Philistine will be just like one of them. And so Saul says, well, you're not going out unprotected. Put my armor on. Can you imagine? Saul was a head taller than everyone else in the nation of Israel. That's why they selected him as king to begin with, because he had the kingly look. Can you imagine trying to put on his armor as a youth? There's no way it would have fit. David knew it didn't fit. He was uncomfortable in it, so he took it off. And so he goes down to the battlefront with a slingshot. I mean, you gotta love it. He picks up 5 smooth stones from the brook. I recently was talking with Josh Austin's dad, Fred. I don't know if you've ever met him, but you need to. He's an incredible guy, great veteran. and just a heart for the Lord that's impeccable. Well, he and Josh, his last overseas trip that Fred is able to take, he knows physically because of his illness he's not going to be able to go overseas anymore. Well, he and Josh went to the Holy Lands. And he told me about going down to this area that would have been close. He said he doesn't know if it's for sure the exact spot where David would have slain Goliath, but it's close. It's in the vicinity. And he said, I reached down and picked up a smooth stone. He said it would have been about the size of a baseball. He said, but I picked that up just to feel it and to think of how rich that story became in 1 Samuel when he was holding that stone in his hand. And to think about how that David goes to the battlefront and you see the courage of youth as Goliath comes, and he's appalled that they send a child to fight him. And he says, I'm going to break you and I'm going to feed you to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Now his enemy is trying to discourage him. But you see, David's courage was not in himself or in his own ability. His courage was in God. You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the living God of Israel, and He will deliver you into my hands this day. Smack! Right between the eyes, and that giant fell to the ground, and David took his sword, the sword of Goliath, and chopped off his head. Now, what do you think that did to the courage on the part of the Philistines? Gone. We're out of here. See ya. And then, isn't it interesting how the courage then came to the Israelite army? Because the giant had been defeated. Now, I don't know what giants you're going to face in your leadership. But you're going to face them. It may be health. It may be finances. It may be church issues. I don't know what giants you're going to face, but you're going to face some giants in your life. And you need to have courage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 14, the Apostle Paul, in writing to the church at Corinth, tells them, act like men. That statement alone should help us realize that we need to arise to the occasion and to realize that it's not in our abilities, it's not in who we are. And even though everyone around us may discourage us, go to the battlefront, trusting that God will deliver. That's where our courage comes from. And that's why David throughout the Psalms was able to say over and over, God, my rock, my strength, my salvation. And he kept saying those things because he knew. Courage. We need courage. We're going to talk a lot more about courage later on and how we develop that kind of courage as we look at some of those areas in our leadership. But we need to realize that one of the great challenges for leadership when it comes to leading is they lack the courage. Did you have your hand up?
I did. I was going to just make sure that it doesn't go unnoticed that in verse 48, and you went all around it, but David ran quickly up to showing how much courage. He could not wait to show God how much courage he had. He had talked about it. He had had a chance to run away from it. He had had a chance to second thought, third thought, fourth thought, but he still ran quickly. It also reminds me of when Abraham got up early in the morning to go sacrifice his son. It shows how much courage he had. You were all around it.
That's all right. It's a great thought. I'm glad you brought it out. That is very true. And we need to do the same. When we face giants, we need to run to the front. It's just awesome to think about. And so we need that courage. We'll talk more about it as we go through the quarter. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas that ties into this that really challenges leadership when it comes to leading, and that is discouragement. discouragement. Satan wants to discourage you. Because he knows that if he can discourage you enough, what will happen? Quit. You quit. And that's what he wants you to do. And you're going to be facing that throughout the time that you're in school. And I'm amazed at having been here over the last 4+ years to notice some of the different individuals who have come to school and have given up. And granted, there are going to be some times when legitimate concerns cause people to have to leave. But sometimes it's just that people get discouraged. Whether it's the overwhelming workload, or whether it's the financial situation of support, or whether it's family issues. I've been talking with an individual, and while we were in Arkansas, visiting the girls at Searcy, this young man that I'm trying to get to come to school here, he graduates from Harding in May, wants to be involved in mission work. And I said, brother, you need to come to Bear Valley. I've known him since he was 7, and he's told me all his life that he wanted to come to Bear Valley. And I'm thinking, now is the perfect opportunity for you to come. Well, his girlfriend, who is a fiancée now, was not wanting him to come. And so she was working in a way that was discouraging him. And so we've communicated back and forth, and I had opportunity to spend some time with both of them while we were there and try to address some of the reasons why she was doing this. And it appears as of now that they are coming together. And so it's cool to see the way that while Satan was working to discourage him through any means, it may be through a girlfriend or through a wife or through a child or through a parent. I'll never forget when Cheryl and I decided that we wanted to go to Prince Rupert, British Columbia to work, that my dad and my mom were trying to prevent us from going. They were discouraging us from being involved in mission work. And I'm like, you've brought me up my whole life to be a servant of the Lord, and now I finally wised up after 28 years of living in the gutter to do this, and you're telling me not to go? Man, Satan will work in any way he can to try to prevent us from doing the Lord's work. And it happens in leadership. It challenges them from leading because they get discouraged. And you see it throughout Scripture. And we need to make sure that we don't allow that to happen. Think about the letter to the Hebrews, the Christians, the letter of Hebrews. The writer of the book of Hebrews, how many times throughout the book is telling them, encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, lest any one of you become hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12 and 13. And so when you think about why he's writing to them, they're discouraged. They're wanting to leave Christianity, go back and live under the old law. And the writer of the book of Hebrews is saying, you can't do that. You're going to have to encourage one another. And he gives them all of the reasons and showing the superiority of Christ over everything that they're trying to go back to. And there's nothing for them to go to. And that's why he tells them that they need to encourage one another, and all the more as they see the day approaching. In chapter 10, verse 25. So we need to make sure that we're working to encourage our leadership and not discourage them, and not be a tool through which we discourage them. And I wonder if that would even change the outcome in the future for men wanting to serve as elders. If they knew that they were going to be getting encouragement for the task before them from members instead of discouragement from members. They face such a great task and such an incredible responsibility. We need to make sure we don't allow discouragement to be a part of causing them to not lead. Then we have this idea of being too busy. I wish now, I don't know, it's been so many years ago, I don't even know if it still exists or if I could find it. I haven't tried in several years. But I wonder sometimes if that's not exactly what Satan is doing in our culture. He's trying to fill our lives up with so much stuff that we are so busy taking care of working in all of these different areas of our life that we lose sight of what's most important as leaders in the Lord's kingdom. And I tell you, I'm guilty. I'll never forget when we were in Prince Rupert. Of course, I had convinced myself up front that it was a part of how we were working to reach out into the community. But my kids were involved in every sport you can imagine. I mean, it went year-round. From ice skating to swimming and diving to basketball, badminton, volleyball, soccer, softball. They played one sport after another all year long, almost the entire time we were there. My kids didn't even know what sports were till we moved to Prince Rupert, and I got a call one day from Rob, and he goes, "Is it all right if I'm on the basketball team?" And I said, "Son, you don't know how to play basketball." He said, "I told him that." I'm thinking that says a lot for the basketball team. But I learned very quickly that the coach really was just trying to encourage any student to be involved actively. It didn't matter whether he could play or not. The coach didn't care about winning. He just wanted kids involved. And so as a result, I learned the importance of being a volunteer. Because I thought the only way my son's going to survive is if I try to help. But see, they were active. But what happened was we got so busy with activities. I mean, Cheryl and I sometimes would be going two different directions. We'd have one practice on one end of town and a practice on the other end of town at the same time, or a game in both places. And I mean, we couldn't keep up. And when I think about the culture that we live in now in the United States of America, what is the number one reason why people don't want to come to a gospel meeting, or they don't want to come to a VBS, or they don't want to be involved in door knocking?
Too busy.
I'm too busy. I've got more stuff going on than you can imagine. And if we're not careful, we tend to convince ourselves when people ask us, "Could you be involved in doing this?" And the thing is, man, I am working so much, it's just unreal. And yet, if we really sit down and begin to examine it, are we really? Or has it just become an easy out? I'm too busy. I've often heard that if you really want to get something done, ask someone who's busy. They're the ones who will get it done. Interesting thought. Now, my question is this. If a leader really is too busy, then what should he do?
Delegate.
Needs maybe delegate? Rearrange his priorities? Ultimately, he's going to have to do what?
I'm say no.
He's going to have to say no. He may have to give something up. Once he examines his priorities and he thinks about how he can delegate in all these other areas, he may have to just say, look, something's got to give. He may have to step down from what he's leading in. Or he may have to give up something else he's involved in order to fulfill his responsibilities. But it keeps people from leading. It challenges their leadership because they're too busy. How about this one? What challenges leaders in leading is the assignments are unclear. The assignments are unclear. I used to have the word ambiguity up here. I thought, that didn't go over when I was teaching this class overseas. I'd be teaching guys that English was not their first language, and I'd say, because of ambiguity, and they would be like,
That's unclear.
that's unclear. So anyway, I changed it to the assignments are unclear. But isn't that true? A lot of times what challenges leaders in leading is they don't know what they're supposed to do. And I'm going to use the example, and Donnie, I'm going to use you since you're sitting here. I'll never forget that when I first came in to get involved in the extension program, there wasn't a job description for anybody in the whole program. The coordinators, Donnie in fact, came to me and he said, would you please help me and tell me what I'm supposed to be doing? Well, why wasn't he leading? Because he didn't know what he was supposed to be doing. Well, you're going to find that in a lot of situations. We need to have a good VBS. Would you take care of that? And they don't want to say no, and so Mark's going to say yes. And then about 3 weeks into it, you're going to say, how's it coming? Well, we haven't done anything. Why? Well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I mean, am I supposed to write the material? Or am I supposed to order the material? Am I supposed to get somebody else to help me? What am I supposed to do? Well, when we don't provide people with a clear description of their assignment, if a leader doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing in his position, then he's not going to be able to lead, or certainly not lead very well. And so the idea is, what challenges leaders when it comes to leading is their assignments are unclear. So make sure we eliminate that by providing a good description of what needs to be done.
You know, this is something that is very apparent and weak. I mean, when you're talking about this, first thing that's popping into my mind is eldership. And this can kind of tie into a little bit of what you were talking or hinting at before is, you know, we have to lean on other leaders as well. We have to rely, let's say that Chris and I and Brad over here are the elders. You know, my gift may not be discernment. My gift may not be wisdom, knowing where the church needs to go. And so I come in, I don't know what we need to do. Brad says, you know, I believe that this church is fumbling around because X. There's your vision.
Okay.
We have to rely on God to give us the clarity because we as men don't have it.
And I tell you, something I'd like to include with what you're saying, because I think you're right, is the fact that when you're in a situation where you have other leaders that you are leaning upon and relying upon, you still have to know what your gift is and to be able to bring that complement to that leadership, especially from the standpoint of an eldership. I think it's beautiful, the elders that I have been around, to see how that they all bring different abilities to the table and how that they begin to recognize, okay, you have this ability. And so as a result, we need you to focus on this and making sure this is overseen or that it's done. Delegating to deacons who are going to be over a particular area. But as an eldership or as a leader in a congregation that doesn't have an eldership, we need to make sure that we're able to recognize the abilities of others who are involved in that particular situation, and that when we need to accomplish a certain task, whatever that task is, that when we ask someone to do something, that we don't just say, I need you to do this, without explaining some areas that they need to know about to accomplish that task. And to lean upon them for feedback. If you think of some areas that need to be done in regards to this, let me know, because that will only enhance the development of that particular program. And so making those areas clear in whatever way is going to be vital to the development of that leadership.
I couldn't help but laugh when you brought this up because in my last Air Force management course thingy, when this came up, they showed a clip from this movie. I don't like the movie, but the clip is perfect. It's from the movie The Office, where they beat the printer to death. But they're in this girl is in a restaurant like a TGI Fridays, and her boss comes over and says, you don't have enough flair. She says, okay, what do you mean? So like, well, look at your coworker. She's got flair. And what he was talking about was the number of buttons on her smock, on her vest. She says, okay, well, I've got 6, so you're saying I need 8? He's like, well, I just say you need more flair. And what she was trying to get at was, tell me exactly what you want, because you're saying I don't have enough. Well, do I need 20? Do I need 13? Be crystal clear and specific.
Yes. And it makes the work so much easier to accomplish when we know that.
Well, it is funny because the expectations, they have expectations of you, but how are you supposed to know what they are so unclear? And when I got hired to do the youth work at the church, they gave me no job description, nothing. I sat there the first week or so, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do? And then I started asking them, can I do this? Okay, yeah, you can do that. And then I started writing my own job description. I'm like, but there was no job description. So when I left, they said, can you write us a job description? I said, I've been working on one. So
For the last however many.
Yeah.
Well, and I told you guys what happened to me in going to Greenbrier, same kind of idea. It's like, okay, what do you expect me to do? What is my job description? Well, you kind of know how pastors are in their denominations, kind of like that. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't help. But they need to be clear. When they're unclear, it's hard for people to get the work done that needs to be done.
I think of that book, why it was such a bestseller, Purpose-Driven Life.
Yes.
Remember, because it helped people to clarify, to clear things up, what their strengths are, what they should focus on, and not be the wrong match, the wrong fit. The right person in the wrong position or wrong responsibilities, which is not their strengths.
Very good. Another reason that challenges leaders to lead is they lack experience. And we've touched on this to some degree in the past. And it's so funny because I was just yesterday talking with an individual that this came up. I said, so how's the job hunt going? And they told me, said, well, most places that I've talked to say things like, well, we're really looking for somebody with 5 years experience. And we both laughed, and I said, it's sad. It's because in your mind you're thinking, how am I going to get the experience if you don't give me a job? And so the lack of experience, it really keeps leaders from leading. It challenges them in great ways because they want to lead. They've been trained. You guys are getting the training that you need while you're here in biblical matters and doctrine. And so you just need the experience. One of the areas that I really encourage you to be involved in is after you've been here 6 months, to take advantage of opportunities to preach out. And the reason I say that is because you're gaining some experience. And you need that experience. Do not rely simply on the fact that you're going to preach a couple of sermons in Homiletics 1, and you'll preach 2 or 3 in Homiletics 2, and then you'll preach 1 for Homiletics 3. That's not enough experience. You guys need experience when it comes to preaching and teaching.
What do you mean preach out? Means what?
Well, after you've been here 6 months, there are a lot of congregations in the area that need men to come and fill the pulpit for various periods of time. And so the students are required to be here for at least 6 months before they're able to preach out. And so, or to be somewhere else besides Bear Valley. And so you need to take advantage of that. Utilize that opportunity so that you can improve your experience.
Now, I think it's just as important, and maybe there's an argument that it's even more important to practice teaching classes.
Oh, yes.
Because that's when you come in contact with people. And boy, can that be, it's easy to stand up there for 20, 30 minutes and say what you want with nobody replying.
Yeah.
Teaching.
Yeah, learning how to respond and address questions that come in. And you'll get some bizarre questions. I tell you, it's interesting what people will ask when it comes to a Bible class. And you're like, okay, that's not even what we're studying. But they want an answer. But anyway, lack of experience. It challenges leaders in leading. And another is they're not respected. Now again, this list that we're going through is not exhaustive, and it's not going to be one that every area applies to every individual, every situation. But you're going to face times where someone is in a leadership position and they're not respected. People are going to resist leadership when leadership is involved in questionable habits. We had a situation years ago where a leader in a congregation dipped snuff. You could see the ring in his back pocket. An elder in the church. Well, he wasn't respected. And so, whatever the habit may be, it may be places they go, it may be activities they participate in, whatever the habit is, you need to realize that when a leader is not respected for those questionable habits, it may be something as simple as what they watch on television. I'll tell you guys right now, you need to be very cautious about what you tell others you watch. Now, I'm not telling you right, wrong, or indifferent, but I am telling you this. You can offend a lot of people in a hurry and lose respect when you tell them that you're involved in watching a movie that's an R-rated movie. And you're thinking, well, what's wrong with watching a movie? Well, for some people, there are a lot of things. And especially when you got young people involved. So be careful what you tell people that you watch as far as movies are concerned or that you recommend. I appreciate the fact that Brad prefaced by saying, I don't watch it, don't like it. But he was forced to see it in that particular setting and it provided an illustration. But just be careful when you're talking to others about, oh yeah, I went to see Night of and whatever it is, and then it's this R-rated movie and people are like, Really? Why did you go see that? And so they begin to question your habits. The other thing is the type of music you listen to. Be cautious about what you tell people that you listen to and what you post on Facebook. When you look at your profile, if Marilyn Manson is one of your favorite artists, don't be surprised that people question your credibility as a leader. I mean, be careful, guys, what you put on there that are your favorite movies and your favorite musicians and all of those areas, because people are watching you as a Christian, as a leader, in all of those areas. If you lose that respect, and we're going to talk more about respect later on, as I mentioned, but it challenges people in leading when they're not respected, and those are some of those areas that affect that.
I was just going to say, they'll not respect you even if you aren't doing questionable things.
They can. That's true.
I mean, yeah.
And certainly if you're involved in them. I mean, it just gives them a reason
Yeah.
to even take that even further.
People are, over the years, become more and more skeptical and more, I've got the term for it, but it's not coming in my mind, but we've seen so many leaders, talking of the world, politicians, leaders in every level, the truth finally comes out and it's just worse, and we, become very, I don't know what we call that term, but, very hard to respect anyone.
And once it's lost, it's almost impossible
It's
to
not
regain
like
it.
Guilty, he's innocent until proven guilty. Now it's the tide has turned. It's
Guilty
until it's
proven innocent.
Yeah.
And then, even if proven innocent, once the accusation is made and the character is destroyed, some people don't ever get over it, even though you're proven innocent. So guard your heart, guard your influence. And even when you go to your home and you start looking at the list of movies that you have that are out there on display, and people start going over there and say, oh, well, what kind of movies do you watch? Really? I mean, be careful. Be careful. Because certainly when a person's not respected, then it's going to challenge their leadership. Being indecisive is also an area that challenges leaders when it comes to leading. Indecisive. I like this section. And it's interesting to me because obviously an indecision or being indecisive is a decision. I mean, you might not want to think that it is, but to not make a decision or to be indecisive is a decision. I used to have a coach in high school, Jack Haney. Boy, I don't know what it was, but he used to just, I could hear my name ringing from the rafters because he would, Turner! I mean, I don't think he ever knew my first name, but he just always on me. And the thing that he said to me one time, he said, when you hesitate, you're beaten. He said, don't hesitate. Be decisive. You think about Elijah at Mount Carmel. Why do you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, if Jehovah is God, then serve Him. But if Baal is God, then serve Him. But don't be indecisive. And yet we know that being indecisive is a decision in and of itself. But here's my question. When leadership is indecisive, then what happens as a result?
Nothing.
Somebody's going to make decisions. Who's going to make them?
That's why the wives start preaching.
I mean, don't you have a situation to where you have non-leaders making decisions? You have dissenters making decisions? You have the circumstances or the situations making decisions? Don't be indecisive. You may make the wrong decision, and if you do, back up and admit that you made a mistake. But don't be indecisive. It is detrimental to your leadership if you are indecisive. Make a decision, but don't ride the fence. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't take time to make sure you gather all the information. Don't be quick to make a decision, but don't be indecisive. Gather the information that you need, get all the facts, and then make a decision. If you make the wrong one, then back up and admit it and say, look, I made a mistake. I made the wrong decision here. Admit it quickly, as we've already talked about, and then let's go in this direction. But certainly, to not be decisive is, boy, it's detrimental to your leadership. It challenges leaders when it comes to leading. Another area that challenges leaders is they're directionally challenged. I love this one too. They're directionally challenged. Since we're all men in this classroom,
Let me check that.
isn't it fascinating how we do not want to stop and ask for directions? Admit it, guys, we don't. Pride will not allow us to. We're driving down the highway, lost as a goody bird, and we're trying, and our wife is sitting there and saying, would you please just stop and ask for directions? Now, I don't have that issue anymore because of GPS. Thank you, GPS. I love my Garmin because I don't have this issue when I travel. But think about it for just a moment. Do you want to follow somebody that doesn't know where they're going? Follow me. How long are you going to follow me if I'm walking in a circle? Not very long. I want to move forward. I want to accomplish something besides wearing out a path in the carpet. When leaders are directionally challenged, when they don't know where they're going, then it really hinders their leadership. Now, what causes that? What causes leaders to not know where they're going?
Unclear what they're going to do.
Unclear assignments, possibly.
Maybe a lack of vision.
Lack of vision.
Not wanting to take a risk. Everything is about risks.
Okay. They don't want to take a risk.
Afraid they'll come back to them again, and
Oh, they don't want to take responsibility. Yeah. It's going to come back on me. I don't want to do that. So they
covering the bases.
covering the bases. And really, it's true. And we could list out a number of areas, and most of which we've already talked about. But when leaders are directionally challenged and they do not know where they're going, it hinders their leadership. Another area that I think is very significant when it comes to challenging leaders in their leadership, and that is they're not fully committed. They're not fully committed. In Arkansas, we have this term, and those of you in the South will appreciate the idea of being wishy-washy. Well, if you're not from the South at all, you probably don't have a clue what that is. But the idea is, make up your mind. It kind of ties in with the idea of being indecisive. But the part that's detrimental about not being fully committed is very similar to what Rajid was just talking about. I'm not sure I want to give everything to this. I'm just not willing to stick my neck out here and take the risk. And so they're not fully committed. Now, from a biblical standpoint, we really can't do that, can we? What's the account in the book of Revelation, chapter 3? Lukewarm Christians. Laodicea. Jesus said, I wish that you were hot or cold. But because you are lukewarm, I'm going to vomit you, spew you out of my mouth. It made him sick. And the reason was they just weren't committed. And we need to make sure that we don't allow a lack of commitment on our part to be that which hinders our leadership. The Bible, again, emphasizes a great deal about commitment, even though it may not use this term. When you think about the idea of our confessing Jesus as Lord, as the Christ, the Son of God, we are making a commitment. And the idea of Jesus being the master of our life does not give us rights. Now, I'm not getting into a political discussion. That's not my purpose. But in some ways, now I love the country we live in, appreciate the benefits that we have in this country, but in some ways, democracy has hurt the church and the growth of it. Because people think they have rights in the church. I have a right. And if you don't do this the way I want to, then I'm going to go over here to another congregation until I get what I want. As Christians, we don't have rights. We don't vote when it comes to the leaders of a congregation. We don't get to vote on whether we want to do this or not do this. The Bible is our guide. It's our creed book. And if we're going to make Jesus the master of our life, we're going to follow him. It's a dictatorship. That's why Jesus said you're either on the right or the left. You're either building on rock or you're building on sand. You're either a sheep or you're a goat. You're either walking in the light or you're walking in darkness. There is no middle road. You can't be not fully committed. And it hinders leadership. Christopher?
Okay. I had to look at my notes. Luckily, I typed it. Also, when we're not fully committed as leaders, the second something gets tough, we're going to be like, well, I wasn't always in it, so now's the time to get out anyways.
Very good. And that's exactly how Jesus described the hireling.
I kind of compared that to kind of marriage. People, if they're not committed to their spouse, they're going to give up the first time they have a fight with their spouse.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And that's exactly right. And that's not what we need in the church, is that lack of commitment. We need people who are fully committed. Think about Caleb, who wholly devoted himself to the Lord. God described him as such. So great leadership needs to be committed. Another area that will obviously hinder or challenge leaders when it comes to leading is procrastination. Every year I do this. I have to restudy how I say this, because I've said it wrong for so long that it's hard for me to say it right. But the idea is, why do today what you can put off and do tomorrow? Now, that's not the way that statement's supposed to be said. I mean, the idea is that, yeah, you're making me.
No, seriously, I need.
The idea is, why do today what you can put off and do tomorrow? But the statement literally is supposed to be, why put off till tomorrow what you can do today? But see, I said it wrong for so long, I have to go back and review my notes pretty extensively to get this thing right. But what we do is we tend to live by the first one. Why would I do this today when I can put it off and do it tomorrow? This is what happens to a lot of guys in this school. They get their assignments and they keep thinking, oh, it's no big deal, I can do it on Saturday. And they don't think about, I could go ahead and do it today and have it done, and then if something happens just by chance on Saturday and I can't get it done, I already have it done. But instead what happens is they put it off and they think on Saturday they'll do it, and then they get sick. Oh, I wished I'd have finished that paper on Tuesday. Now I feel so bad I can't do it. My mind won't work. I can't think. And so we put it off. We procrastinate. And we need to develop the mentality of why put off till tomorrow what we can do today. I think sometimes the approach that guys take in a lot of areas of leadership is that they're just hoping that the Lord is going to come back before it's due. Do not procrastinate. The putting off and putting off, after a while it catches up with you, and it will hurt you. So don't be a procrastinator. Schedule it, do it, and if you can do it early, do it early. Got to go first.
I see the same thing with people sitting in the pews who know the truth, know what it is that they need to do, but they're just like, well, I just, I'm going to do that. I'll do it next week.
Yes.
Next month I'll respond.
So true. So true. And it oftentimes catches up.
It's the perpetual tomorrow, and it's not promised to us.
That's exactly right. Great thought.
Many of the things I was just wondering how, okay, a person is indecisive, how can he become decisive? A person's not fully committed, how can he become fully committed? If a person is a chronic procrastinator, how can he become not a procrastinator? So, I mean, we have all these.
Yeah. Well, this is all the negative side of this.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at the positive side as we go through the quarter and looking at a lot of ways that we can overcome these areas and develop what we need as leaders to become what we should be. The section that we're going to follow up today with is how do you motivate the unmotivated? And so we're going to talk about some of those areas in just a few moments. Another area that challenges leaders in leading is they are pessimistic. They are pessimistic. In some of the courses I'm taking at Fuller right now, it's been interesting, particularly this class that I'm taking in lifelong leadership development. He basically uses the rings of a tree as a description of how that each part is a layer that's had a significant part of our life that's been involved in shaping us how we are. And he describes that there are different phases of our life that we go through. You have that early phase where you have a lot of energy and you're excited and you have the strength physically to do stuff. And then you have the middle stage, that middle gamer, that really falls into that 35 to 55 age bracket where you begin slowing down a little bit and you're not able to do the things that you used to do when you were 20. And you tend to be more cynical about different areas. And I tell you, when he was going through that list, I'm like, I mean, he was just hitting me. And when he said cynical, I thought, that's me. It is so easy to get negative about what's going on and how things can't be done. And when you start looking at situations, you start saying, we can't do that. We can't do that. This pessimistic attitude is what limits the power of God to work in the lives of people to accomplish His will and His purpose. And so we need to make sure we don't allow pessimism to hinder or challenge us in leading the way that we need to. Another area that is involved is a lack of tact. I'm laughing because I already know the illustration that I plan to use. But isn't it funny how that some people, every time they open their mouth, they offend somebody?
That's true.
I know a young man, bless his heart, he's got such a great attitude about wanting to be a servant and wanting to preach. But he just doesn't realize sometimes that the way he approached things that he says offends people. He was preaching for a small congregation, and the first words out of his mouth when he got up to preach was, "Folks, I'm serious about worship, and if you're not, there's the door." I like it. See ya. I mean, some people lack tact when it comes to the idea of how they say things. And so we need to be careful not to let our leadership be challenged by the fact that we lack tact. And so that we learn to say things appropriately. Colossians 4 verse 6 is a powerful verse. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you know how to respond to every person. A lack of tact, boy, it can be detrimental when it comes to our leadership.
Put Ephesians 4:29 is right.
Yes, Ephesians 4:29 goes very well with that same idea about let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth. I used to remember Brother Tharp used to say, let no rotten communication come out of your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment.
I was thinking of what Wayne Berger would say in personal evangelism. Sometimes we're so worried about tact that we never make contact. Jesus, in Matthew 23, some would say, well, he wasn't very tactful, and it's like 5 to 8 times he calls them hypocrites right out in public. Everybody's around. There can be a balance between tact and and being spineless.
Yes. Now, obviously, we're not talking about a lack of courage. We're just talking about a statement like I used as an illustration. Obviously, if it's the first time you're with a group of people, it wasn't like Jesus hadn't been around the Pharisees for 3 years and knew what was taking place. But certainly we need to be careful.
The balance that's necessary is in that verse, Ephesians 4:29, because of the contrast, no unwholesome word, but only such a good word as is good for edification, which is a biblical injunction to think before you speak.
Yes.
Because you have to think to yourself and decide what is the word that will build here as leadership.
Very good. Very good. The next area is walking by sight. Now, we talked about walking by faith. And the verse is 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7. And there, Paul says, we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, I want you to think about this for just a moment. And the reason is because the word translated sight, the root of that word literally has to do with emotions or feelings. And the word faith has the definite article. So he's saying we walk by the faith and not by sight. The idea is we do not allow our emotions, our feelings to control the decisions that we make when it comes to our relationship with God. But instead, we walk by the faith. But when leaders are walking by sight, that means that they're not involved in allowing the Word of God to be that which determines the direction. And oftentimes what we allow as far as the appearance of things, that's when we start allowing the culture to dictate the direction that we've talked about in the past for the decisions instead of allowing God's Word to determine the direction of our decisions. Whether we're talking women's role, instrumental music, and the list goes on. And so leaders are challenged in their leading when they walk by sight and they are not walking by faith. And I believe that one of the areas that is also very significant is we become comfortable with the status quo. We're satisfied with the status quo. It's very difficult to get out of a rut. There's a lot of friction. It takes a lot of energy to get something that's moving, even though it may be moving smoothly. It may not be moving in the right direction. And so it's not uncommon for leaders to be very comfortable with the way things are. They don't want to change. And so because they are comfortable with the status quo, they don't want to do anything different. I mean, really, think about it. We have done it this way for 50 years. Why would we change it? If it's not broke, don't fix it. And so we allow that mentality to really become, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with some of the traditions that we do, but we can't allow changes that are still correct, that may not follow in line with the tradition, to cause us to go into a frenzy. And I'll tell you an example. For years, the Lord's Supper trays were covered with a cloth. And the purpose was to keep flies out of it. Well, when someone came along and invented the metal lids, it divided a church in Texas. Because they were so comfortable with the way it had always been. And one gentleman said, "You can't do that." And if we're not careful, we become that way about other areas. Be careful not to become so comfortable with the status quo that it prevents us from leading the way that we need to lead.
Final words of a dying company are, but we've always done it that way.
Ah, so true.
Dying.
So true. A dying company.
I
Yes.
think it's a challenge when you've been in one place for long, whether
Yeah.
in a leadership position or not. And I was just reflecting back, and it took me a while to sink in why I was asked to move from one school to another.
Yeah.
Every school you go, and that's what I learned is, clean the slate, start over, because the culture is different.
Yeah.
The way of doing things. Every leader, every principal, everyone, it filters down from there.
It gets difficult. And I tell you, in the extension program, it's the same stuff. The former administration did things a certain way for so long, and now, as we're trying to implement some changes, it's not being met very well with some. I mean, it's challenging to do things different. And so, got to be careful. So those are some reasons that really challenge leaders when it comes to their leading. In the time that we have remaining today, I have a couple of areas that I want to talk about regarding how do you motivate the unmotivated. How do you motivate the unmotivated? You're going to deal with individuals that are just not motivated.
And so how do you motivate them? Well, let me give you a couple of areas, and we will close out class in talking about that. First of all, you have to identify what do you mean by unmotivated. How do you define unmotivated? What do you mean as a leader? It's going to have to be quick or we're never going to get this covered. I mean, if you got something that's really going to add to this,
They only see what they're looking at.
Huh?
They only see what they're looking at. They can't see beyond. You know, there's no motivation if I can't see anything other than what's in front of me.
Well, hold that thought because we're going to talk about that in the questions that we need to ask. But first of all, we got to identify what do we mean unmotivated? Are they not doing what we want them to do? Is that why they're not motivated, or are they not doing what they need to do? Is that why they're not motivated? So we have to first of all identify what we mean by unmotivated. Secondly, we have to ask the right questions. Now, if you want, I can give you time to write these down at another time, but right now I just want to give you the list. You can formulate your own questions, or you can get what you want. There are about 5 or 6 of them. But think about the questions for just a moment that need to be asked when it comes to helping those who are unmotivated. First of all, do they know they are supposed to be doing this? It's very difficult to motivate somebody to do something if they don't know they're supposed to be doing it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So ask yourself, do they know they are supposed to be doing this? If not, that may be why they're not involved. And you may have to just simply tell them what they're supposed to do. Secondly, you need to ask the question, do they know how to perform those actions? There are a lot of people that know what they're supposed to be doing, they just don't know how to do it. They're not equipped to do it. And so ask the question, are they equipped? Do they know how to perform this task? If not, then equip them. You might find they're a lot more motivated than you think if you just equip them with doing the task. Third question that you need to ask is, when was the last time they were reminded? Well, I tell you, I told my wife I loved her when I married her 50 years ago, and if I change my mind, I'll let her know.
Amen.
Well, I wonder why she's not motivated to get up and fix your breakfast for you every day. Well, obviously in a congregation, you give someone an assignment, and you're talking to them about how to do it, and in 5 years down the road, you don't seem to see motivation on their part. Well, when's the last time you reminded them of what they needed to be involved in doing? When's the last time the church was really encouraged to be involved in, and then you fill out whatever that is. So when was the last time you reminded them? That may be one of the reasons they're not motivated. Are there clear reasons the actions are important? Think about this for just a moment. Have you explained to the individual or group of individuals why they need to be involved in doing this? Because one of the key motivation factors in your preaching, and we'll talk about in homiletics, one of the key motivating factors is that you're helping people see why this is important, why they need this information. How's it going to help them? Well, have you given clear reasons as to why this particular area is important? The next question you need to ask is, are there clear guidelines of the consequences? Have you explained what's going to happen if they don't do this? You see, we do that with our kids. If you don't get in there in your room and clean it up, then I'm going to, and then we give them the consequences. It was that very statement that caused me to write a series of articles in my leadership blog entitled The World According to If. We live in that world so much. If I only had this. If you don't do this. If. Are there clear guidelines of the consequences? If we don't do this, here's what will result. Sometimes it's the consequences that become a motivating factor in our life. Also, are there regular evaluations of progress? And we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to goal setting. Because when we talk about setting goals, you have to be able to have periods of time where you evaluate the progress. How far have we come? And so when it comes to this idea of motivating the unmotivated, there's some questions that we need to ask. And one of those is, are we regularly evaluating the progress that's being made? Because that could become a very key factor in determining motivation. Then, as we think about identifying what we mean by unmotivated and asking the appropriate questions, we have to realize that when it comes to leadership, as a leader, we are moving people from point A to point B. It is a very simplistic way of defining a leader, but that's what he's doing. Whatever A and B are, he's involved in moving people from point A to point B. And so if you're wanting to motivate people, then you need to help them understand where they are at point A and then show them and lead them to point B. That's what moving people in leadership is all about. So it's moving from point A to point B and helping them understand they need to be involved in that. And then appeal to self-interests. Appeal to self-interests. What are self-interests?
What can I get out of this?
What can I get out of it? Which would that involve? What would that involve?
You mean, I'm sorry, based off what he said, not what how I was reading this. I thought you were asking appeal to things that they're interested in.
That's it.
Oh, okay.
What are they interested in?
Okay.
Money?
Maybe they like
Time
oh,
off.
okay.
Money, job security, respect,
Bigger office, their own
bigger
bathroom,
office,
time off,
time off.
more vacation.
I mean, those are things that appeal to, that's people's interest. That's what they're interested in. Recreation. I mean, all of those areas really come back to what Brad started with, and that's what am I going to get out of it? And so when we think about self-interest, what we're trying to do is appeal to those areas to motivate people. I tell you, my mom used to always say, you attract more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And what she was trying to point out to me was that when you appeal to those areas that people are interested in, they're going to be more likely to be motivated to do it than if you're not. So appeal to those areas that interest people in what they're doing. When we come back on Wednesday, we're going to begin looking at a number of areas concerning Bible leaders. On Friday, sorry, got my days mixed up. Monday really messed me up when we had 2 leadership classes back to back. But everyone leads. Where do they lead? Well, we're going to be looking at where some leaders in the Bible led and how that leadership involved. So Friday, we're going to be talking about those areas. Next week, we'll go through leadership in regular fashion as well as homiletics. And then the following week, the week before Thanksgiving, Doug McNary will be here on the 12th and the 14th. And so he's going to be involved in bringing some material to you that will really be beneficial in regards to your leadership. And he brings a great deal of wealth to the table in areas of his previous experience. But I appreciate very much the comments, and I appreciate very much the willingness to stay with me as we try to move through quite a bit of material today. So we'll pick back up on Friday.